quick updates on. Sweet, there we go. All right, the first thing we wanted to do today is to kick things off by talking about the timelines for the hub. So we went over this last time, but for the folks who weren't able to make it, the way we're thinking about this is there's going to be 3 more phases of how we're rolling out V2 for the hubs. So phase 1 is going to be getting one hub stood up and getting all the messages. So we're going to get everything that's on the network today and replay it into a hub and get things working. We expect that to be done roughly by March 1st. Phase 3, which is the second part that we got going on here, is to get like about 10 hubs stood up. So think of this as like an alpha release where things will be probably pretty unstable, but we'll be working through the bugs and kinks and all of the things. And we have a few volunteers who are going to run hubs. If you're interested, you can DM me. We just have a list of folks going, and we'll try to roll it out slowly as the network is stable. And we expect that to be available by April 1st. So on April 1st, we'll start syncing like 10 hubs and so on. And then phase 4, which we expect done by May 1st, is the sort of no limits, right? Anyone can download a hub here and get things working. Now, to be clear, at any point up until here, you can download your own hub and run it. But insofar as like peering hubs and getting them to work in sync with each other, that like hubs are only going to be sort of in open listening mode once we get to May 1st. So you can start messing around with your own hub here. You can try to connect it to a couple of hubs here, but this is where like you can just download it, run it, wait, and it will sync up a whole copy of the network, and you can use it to build your own applications. Optimistically, we want to shoot for also getting the contracts migrated over to mainnet. So they're on Gurley right now, and we want to move it over. I think this is a bit of a stretch goal, so we'll see how these timelines solidify once we get closer to March, based on how much progress we've made on the hubs. And Paul and Aditya, who are on the call today, are driving most of the work on the hubs and getting things done over time. And if you're working on the hubs or have more direct questions, they're probably the best people to ping in the Farcaster Dev Telegram channel about stuff there. Paul and Aditya, anything you want to add that I missed on the timelines? Okay, sweet. The next thing I want to talk about, and this is more. Sorry, does someone have a question on this? No, okay, great. The next thing I want to talk about, and this is more of an open discussion, is this doc here about making casts more flexible. So I'll voice over like how we're thinking about it right now, and this is still sort of an idea in progress. So this is not our final, here's how it's going to be, but more of a, hey, this is what we have sort of a strong opinion on the way things are looking. But would love to collect feedback from everyone on this call before we go ahead and solidify this into a decision. Okay, so the way we're thinking about this is we want casts to be like, I use the word Turing complete loosely, or like the idea of social Turing complete, where the general notion is, can you build most interesting social applications just using the framework and bits and pieces that we have today? So one sort of litmus test for this is like, could you build most existing public social networks using the Farcaster framework? Like, could you build a TikTok-like client? Could you build a Twitter-like client? Could you build something that looks like a public Instagram? That's sort of one part of the question. The second part is, can you also do new and interesting things that don't exist today? And can you kind of go and build things that look like slightly different clients that don't exist in the world today? And if the answer to both questions is yes, then we have something that's like a really nice building block that allows people to go and remix and come up with new and interesting ideas and do things beyond what the protocol originally imagined. And that's kind of the goal, right? Is to actually let people go and be more creative and explore things that we don't necessarily have a good notion of how they work today. The counterpoint to this, or the second goal that we want to do in parallel to this, is we want to make sure that casts aren't fragmenting liquidity. Whatever design we take, we want to make sure that like it's not something where one client creates a cast that then doesn't show up in another client or doesn't work in another client or requires significant developer input to get it to work, right? We want the general notion to be like, hey, if people are creating and adding to the network, especially in the early state, it benefits everybody on the network. And so if you add a new client that does something, that content is actually accessible and available to other clients. And these sort of goals are like important to consider because there is a design pattern that where you satisfy both of them, but in a lot of cases, when you make decision A, you actually make it work, or when you make decision A, you make it better for goal 1, but worse for goal B. And so as an example, if we just said, hey, casts are completely open-ended schema, they're just a set of bytes, and you can kind of do whatever you want with them, that actually makes it really, really hard for the developer building the new client, because I could come up with a new format that say, hey, I have some encoded data on here, and you have to figure out what format I'm using to render the cast, or it doesn't show up on your client, and that sort of fragments the whole network and makes it less and less useful. Whereas if we have some sort of common schema on how to represent and define and visually render things, but give people enough flexibility to tweak things within that, you can kind of go and do interesting things. So I want to go further down this into some of the more messy details, but I'll pause here and see if people have questions on this direction or thoughts on the two goals that we've set out up here. Okay, no questions. Great. Dan, anything you wanted to add on this?
I think the only thing I would say is, can you guys hear me okay? Okay. The only thing I would say is we're very open to feedback here. And I feel like, sometimes we're going to have our point of view and people might feel like, oh, I'm not going to be able to change that. So if you want to do that in a public forum, if you want to do that in a private way, like just reach out to us and we're open to have a conversation. I think the thing that we want to optimize for, though, is, as Varun kind of mentioned, is actually creating a lot of permissionless innovation without getting too specific up front. We're getting better at doing this, right? And so I think this proposal to us feels like the right way to actually allow other clients to move faster than either the protocol team or the Merkle team. And I've been using this term on Telegram and some others, green bubble, blue bubble. But it's the idea that you can actually have something that if other people adopt your standard, you get this like magical experience, the blue bubble. But if you, and obviously Apple doesn't allow other people to use blue bubbles, but put that to the side. If not, green bubble can actually still be sufficient and not a terrible user experience. And I think that is the model that we're trying to approach for here. And so if we get it right, I actually think what will happen is people are going to have these specialized clients. They're going to have these amazing experiences around video or whatever things that we haven't even come up with yet. And then what's going to end up happening with Merkle or Discover or Purple or any other client that might not have adopted it, you're still going to get the distribution, which some of you are much younger than me, but like I remember the early days of Facebook's Open Graph. It was actually too much, but this idea that if you were using any app that you logged in with Facebook, that app developer could actually push that activity into your newsfeed. And when done right, it was actually kind of this amazing passive discovery mode. Spotify being a good example, it was like a little overkill every song you listen to. But imagine you could take like 3 or 4 people are using this app. Oh, wow, this is a cool new way for me to discover this app, which basically today doesn't really exist. Like there's no easy way to see of the people you're following on Twitter, what new app are they using outside of them explicitly doing it versus something passive. And so that's like the vision, assuming we can be smart about signal to noise ratio. You get all of this great distribution across all these other clients in the green bubble experience. And for those that want to actually go the extra step to implement the best native way of displaying whatever content, that will be great for consumers. So I think it's a win-win for everybody.
So Manan, you had something you want to say?
Yeah, I just wanted a little clarity on goal 2 here. I do anticipate like clients filtering out certain type of content which might not be appropriate for like that specific client. Is that an assumption as part of this goal as well?
Yeah, I think that's totally fine. Like if you have access to all the casts and you as a client want to say, hey, I don't want to render things that are not pictures or not videos, that's totally fine. And we actually want to make that as easy as possible. We just don't want to make it so that if you do want to build a client that renders everything, by default, you have to do very little work to get to that place. And then you can do additional work to customize.
Agreed. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, and I would even argue like people taking the time to make that green bubble experience, you're going to get that much more usage to your app because people are going to be like, why am I seeing all these things? Click, they go, and now they want to install it.
Yeah. Okay, so let me start with the current solution, which is just like how things work today as defined in the protocol, which I think gets us like, call it 60 to 80% of the way there. And then there's like 3 or 4 ideas that I think will get us 100% of the way there. And I also want to touch on a few ideas that we talked about and we considered in some of the Telegram channels that people had around the video clients that I think we're not going to do for a couple of reasons, and want to get your feedback on all of this. Again, this is sort of like we wanted to come in with a point of view, not this is the way things are going to be. So if you think about it, and we sort of constrain it to the domain of like public social networks, so TikTok, Twitter, that sort of category of stuff. Largely every post is like media or text or both. So you either have like a header image, a header video, or it's just text and it has attachments, and that's largely it. And the way Farcaster casts are designed today at the protocol level is you can have up to 320 characters of text and 2 optional URLs. a side note, the Merkle client only supports one URL today, but that's something we're going to fix in the next few months. But the protocol itself supports 2 embeds on every cast. Now, if you can take whatever video, audio, image media that you were going to upload and actually convert it into a URL, then a Farcaster cast can roughly be used to represent anything that you would put on these social networks. There's still the additional work of parsing it out of the URL and rendering it, but for the most part, this like building block of a cast can be used to represent a video post, an audio post, an image, and all of this stuff, at least at a very abstract level, right? And we also wanted to keep it sort of specific, so we're not doing a lot of like layout specifications on, or we don't give a lot of degrees of freedom on layout specifications. Like you can do line breaks, you can do spacing, and you can say, hey, I would like these 2 images or these 2 links to be shown along with the content, but we don't let the creator of the content define how they're laid out and stuff like that. So if you're building different clients and you want to optimize for where they show up, you have the freedom as an app developer to kind of like change the layout of the things. You can have your attachments at the top or the bottom. You can blow up the images and make the text smaller, or vice versa, and so on. Now, there's two obvious problems with this approach that make it kind of difficult, right? So one, from the perspective of rendering clients, like I'm just like building a client, I want to render stuff on the network. If I want to just show the videos, I have to actually download and parse and unpack every URL in order to be able to go and say, okay, this is actually a video, I care about this, let me render this. Or this is actually, you know, it turns out this is an audio file, I don't care about this, let me go get this out. And that's obviously annoying, and we'll talk about some things we can do to make that a little better. The third thing is like how do writing clients handle this? And I think there's 2 cases. Let's say you're a client that's producing content. Let's say you're producing video or image, or you want to upload this. One way to do it is to use a third-party service to upload your content, right? So you can go and say like, hey, I will make a URL, and you know, like Farcaster uses, or like the Farcaster app uses Imager today to go and upload things. So you can say, hey, we'll just use a service. They'll generate the URL. We'll hand the URL into the cast and upload it. Or maybe you're generating the URL yourself. Like you're actually using like S3 or something low level and hosting the images, and you're producing the URLs, and you control what actually shows up in the URLs. In the latter case, it's kind of nice because you can set whatever tags and whatever metadata you want on the object. In the former case, it's a little annoying because you don't necessarily get to control how the markup data on that URL is going to result in your content being rendered, right? And so the first sort of primitive is we want to make sure that every link, Farcaster clients are focused on rendering them as Open Graph attachments. So this is a very simple primitive, exists today. All the Farcaster clients will have to do it. And so that's kind of like, to Dan's metaphor, that's the green bubble, right? As long as you make sure that your stuff can render as an Open Graph attachment, it will show up in some useful way in the Farcaster app. And you can start simple. You can just have like static images and text and a description, but you can also do fancy things like what GitHub does, which Vercel actually announced as an automatic plugin, where you can dynamically render these cool Open Graph images based on the content that's in there. And so you can actually have like the image show you part of the content, or like the text in the content, or stats and things like that, which actually makes this kind of like a dynamic changing object over time. And so that is like a really cool way to get basically a representation of your content into every post that any client can reasonably render if they know how to display Open Graph tags, which makes it really powerful. So that's kind of the base level, which is like Open Graph tags, and we should make sure that all of these URLs have Open Graph tags. Over time, we can also extend them with Farcaster specific tags. So we can say like, hey, this is, you know, Farcaster colon something on the header, and we might allow you to annotate additional things about the content. TBD what those are exactly, like we still have to do some more thinking about that, but this allows even more flexibility than what Open Graph has, and it will be sort of an Open Graph plus. So you can specify certain things that maybe you can't do in Open Graph, and maybe we do allow some basic layout customization here, where we say like, hey, if there are 2 attachments, you can specify one that is sort of a primary attachment, or you could say like, hey, this is expandable into a large size, and you can add some metadata into the headers around that. The other thing that kind of works for redirecting clients is the notion of proxy redirects. So let's say you don't control the final URL that actually shows up. So you're uploading it to, let's say, YouTube, and you effectively create a YouTube URL. You can actually create a redirect URL using your service, where you say like, hey, the first URL that I share actually goes to my service, and I point to the actual end URL, but I also show you a bunch of Open Graph data about how to render and display this. So rather than listening to the end site, listen to like what I'm telling you in the proxy, which is how it should show up in Farcaster, which allows devs some degree of control when you want to use a third-party service where you can actually control their Open Graph data, but you want the site to sort of respect your data. The last idea is also potentially adding like freeform cast metadata. So this might be like, hey, you get like n bytes, some small number of bytes that you can just add onto a cast. and you can add some static content here. So stuff that you can add here that might be useful is like you can use it to add lat long coordinates to a cast, or you can say like, hey, this is just a bit of additional data. It's not going to be large, so it's just like small amounts of markup, but this could be free form and you can use it in whatever way you like, and you can set the first 2 bytes to a header and then a value, and then it kind of denotes what the actual data package is. So this allows like some amount of remixability. Now, there's actually an important point to talk here, and we'll kind of get to like rejected solutions. We actually don't think it's a good idea to use this metadata to mark up the actual URLs. So like one of the ideas we considered was like, hey, can we let you actually stick in the cast itself something that says this is a video or this is an MP4, so that you can more easily render it without having to go and look at the underlying data. The intrinsic problem with that is casts are static and URLs are dynamic. And so even if you get it right on day one, the URL could change over time and it could be wrong. You also have no guarantee that it's correct. Like the creator could have made a mistake or error. So most applications that are serious about rendering stuff correctly will use this as a guide, but always build the actual Open Graph scraper to go do it. And if you're actually going to do all the work anyway, then this proxy data is not that useful. And so it didn't seem like a very robust solution to the problem. So we think cast metadata is really good for marking up the text and the static content in the cast, which is to say, hey, this is stuff that modifies the text. We don't think it's a great idea for actually encouraging people to go and mark up the dynamic URL content. We think that's best handled by actually having Open Graph tags in the URL, which tells you how to interpret that URL and render it, which can also be changed, and it's more flexible over time. The other idea that we sort of said no to was freeform text annotations. And I think everybody on the chat sort of pointed this out, which is like, it's a hacky way to do things and you can kind of experiment and people can do stuff, but we're not going to go and encourage this as like, hey, this is the way to do things or build new features, because it adds a little bit of kludge to how things are rendered, and it's probably actually going to hurt your distribution. Like if you end up adding a lot of like tags or symbols, then other clients might start ignoring it, and so it actually is something that might end up hurting your distribution. People can still mess around with this and experiment, but I don't think it's like a sustainable long-term way to build features. Okay, so those are the main ideas. One thing that you'll notice kind of as we talk through all these ideas, most of this only makes it easier for clients that are writing or producing content. Reading clients still have to go and parse Open Graph data. Like fundamentally, the building block for like a reading client is you get URLs and you have to go read that URL in order to be able to interpret and render it. But we're trying to make that rendering process as easy as possible by using a bunch of primitives that already exist today and maybe adding some slight extensions on there. We haven't been able to come up with a way that makes it like significantly better for reading clients, which is like, hey, can I just get the video cast from here in like a fully trustworthy, usable way? But I think this is like a solution that gives us this sort of Turing complete building block, and with a little bit of work also makes it easy for every client to render every piece of content generated by other clients. Okay, I've talked a bunch here, so I'm going to hit pause and open this up for discussion. Brian asked a question on chat about video data. So the way we think about like all kinds of media is going to be stored behind URLs. And the way, you have total freedom on where you want to store those URLs. So you can put it on IPFS, you can put it on YouTube, you can put it anywhere. Farcaster itself, like at the protocol and within the hubs, isn't going to be able to store media or data. I think that actually places a significant storage constraint on the hubs. Okay, let me jump to David, who I think raised his hand next.
Sure, yeah. I agree with you on a lot of these constraints and the solutions, and I agree this is definitely better than freeform text that I somewhat suggested in the Telegram. I guess I'm curious of how you see the potential sort of centralizing forces of using sort of maybe like a domain or a URL that serves quite valuable context to a cast, because it seems like you want to push things into URLs, which makes a lot of sense. But there are some things, like you pointed out, location, which might not make sense as a URL. And having them as some sort of primitive in the protocol might allow for certain things where they're not in the protocol. If a client gets 30% majority or something and they start to use a certain URL and it becomes a norm, they can start to sort of cut off access to other clients for certain parts of that context or something like that. I'm curious, is that sort of a consideration that you're considering?
Yeah, I think the way we think about like where data should live in a way that's that solves both the goals of easy to build, but also like decentralized and censorship resistant over time, is we want to make the storage layer for the media like totally abstract by putting them behind URLs. So you can pick the storage engine of your choice, right? If you want this to be on S3 and you want to be serving it up, that's fine. If you want this to be on IPFS and you want to be serving it up from IPFS, that's totally fine. And that gives you like a much better decentralized storage system for your data. And it's totally right. If you want just your cast, it's sort of like NFTs, right? Like if you just care about like the pointer and you're okay with storing the data off chain, you're trading off like centralization for a little bit of customizability. But you can also encode all of the data of the image on chain, which some really interesting NFT projects do. And the equivalent on Farcaster is, do you host your URLs on S3 or do you host your URLs on IPFS? And I think each client can make their choice about how durable they want to make their content. I think that the big constraint here is size, because I think for small pieces of data, call it like hundreds of bytes, it's going to be actually like pretty straightforward to include them in a cast. And I think the way we'll progress is probably by saying, hey, we'll give a free-form chunk of data. And then over time, if we see something being heavily used for a certain purpose, like let's say location, we might actually make it a core primitive in the cast and say, hey, this is so useful, we want this to be on every cast. So that's how I think about it. Anything that's larger than like a kilobyte, I think gets into the like, hey, we need a different network to store this data. Like our network is really, really good and optimized for sending around kilobytes of data and these small message packets, but it's not going to be very well designed for storing, tens or hundreds of kilobytes or megabytes of data. And by the way, there are a bunch of really, really good protocols like, storage, Arweave, IPFS, all of these guys that are focused on building good solutions there, and we should try to make them more composable. Does that make sense?
Sure. Can I ask a quick follow-up? So you mentioned there that the clients are sort of making the choice, and they are, but in some ways the longevity of the content is more of a value to the user that created the content than the client. And by pushing everything out, I get it, but also, especially if you start using S3 or paid services, how long lived are these URLs going to be, right? And it feels like, because there's no way to update them, either you're going to have potentially solutions that make it very easy for developers that just centralize through a central gateway for all URLs to provide this data, which is somewhat centralizing, or you're going to have some clients that eventually just like 20% of URLs from 2 years ago in casts no longer work, right? And I'm curious how you see that, because it seems like something that will decrease the quality of older content. And maybe older content isn't important, but I'm curious.
I would expect basically two things. One, there will be indexing services that archive, like it'll just be opportunity for people to build businesses, and or like it's actually a reason people will use it. It's like, oh, this is how I can actually find this stuff. I think the second thing is, if I understand correctly, Arweave is a good example of something where if you put the content on Arweave, like at least their guarantee right now is that it's going to last forever. It's like an archiving internet archival service, even compared to something like IPFS. And so I actually do think, like, relative to what clients will want in terms of the permanence of any given piece of content, people will opt to do that. That said, there's the, if you're building a Be Real or Snapchat type app, like maybe you don't actually care, right? So it's just like, I think every developer will kind of choose the level of permanence or how much performance, right? Because if you do something that's permanent, but it's not performant, the cost is going to be a lot lower. And so actually letting the market decide here, it might be a little choppy at first, but as the network continues to grow, it's just going to be a massive opportunity for these more dev tool infrastructure companies. And I think you're going to see a bunch of people build stuff because it's going to be a first practical application of it, right? Like we have a lot of this decentralized tech, but like there hasn't been a particular reason to go use it outside of maybe NFTs, right? And most people are using whatever, Pinata and IPFS and things like that.
Cool. Okay. Moving in the order of questions, I think Yandan, you raised your hand.
Hey, yeah. I had 2 quick questions just related to practically how you see Open Graph tags working. So I left this question in the doc, and I just wanted to make sure I understood like the workflow correctly. So like take the video example, and let's say that you have a client that wants to be able to display like a fancy inline video player alongside the cast. but you also want like the default behavior where other clients that aren't video centric can just show a preview, sort of like the embeds on Twitter for YouTube videos. Is the way that you imagine this working for the writer client that the writer should embed a URL that returns an HTML page with the Open Graph tags? So instead of just returning like the video/mp4 MIME type, you're always returning an HTML page with the appropriate Open Graph tags, so that the reader clients can say, oh, like this is just like an Open Graph tag, I'll just show the embed preview. But then it's the responsibility of that fancier read client to say like, oh, I've read the Open Graph tags and there's a video in here. I have special logic for handling videos and I'm going to implement that myself. And it might be a fancy inline player. Is that sort of how you imagine that working with the Open Graph tags?
That's roughly right. I think we have to like go and actually flesh this out. And like, I think the devil's in the details of like how we do it for each media type and each content type. But effectively, it's like, hey, render pages by default because pages have Open Graph tags and headers and you can render that stuff. So don't do direct content links on day one because not everybody can render or show that in a useful way. And then over time, add in data that says, hey, if you as a client want to render the direct content, like if you care about not just showing the Open Graph preview, but want to show this as an inline player and you want to hit the raw file, here's another link that marks that up and does it. And there's by the way, there's a bit of work to do here to specify what that is and how we do it. And we want to leverage existing like HTTP header types to do as much of this as possible. But that's the general direction, which is the like green bubble of like, hey, I can always show you the Open Graph preview, and then the blue bubble of like, oh, I can actually show you something inline that's a little more powerful and cater to what you want.
Got it. That makes sense. And then just like a quick follow-up thought. And the reason that I asked that is I think the video stuff is interesting because I could imagine, like, let's say like a default writer client is writing like short videos or short video links in the casts. And the default experience is just like you scroll through the Merkle client and it's just like previews, but someone wants to like Reelsify or TikTokify that experience, which typically, I think a lot of these apps, they rely on a lot more than just like the singular video. They'll kind of like generate multiple versions and then have like smart client logic in order to like pre-cache things as you go through the smooth scroll view. So I guess in that example, what that might look like with this architecture is like everyone still posts like a singular video link, but maybe you have for your custom read client with that scroll view, maybe you have a centralized indexer that like pre-processes stuff for you so that you can handle those casts specifically. And I just wanted to, does that sound like kind of like a version of the future following this framework?
I think that's exactly right. You can kind of imagine that there's like two pieces to it, right? One is like the client now has the flexibility to say, hey, here's how I want to show my content, but here's like a bunch of additional ways you can render it: small video, large video, low frame rate, high frame rate, whatever, and you can kind of go and pull all of those things. And then there might be services that actually like index and relay this content for you to make this easier. So if you don't want to constantly be indexing the Open Graph tags and it turns out it's a bunch of duplicated work anyway, you could have a service that just does it and says, hey, give me a cast hash and I will give you the media already indexed, so you don't have to do the parsing and the reading of the Open Graph tags yourself. Like that's kind of a nice augmentation to anyone who's building an API service, which will make it easier for all clients to render stuff. And it's still decentralized in that you can go and pull the data yourself and double check it if you want, but it gives you like a fast centralized API that you can use to like quickly serve stuff while quality checking over time.
Got it. That makes sense. Thanks. I think that feels like at least first reaction, it feels like a nice separation of concerns.
Cool. Manan, I know you had a question too.
Yeah, so with Open Graph tags, I think it's definitely an elegant solution, as well as like maybe extending it for other types of content like event invites and other types of media that might not be like natively supported there. One question I had over there is like, do you imagine this becoming into a situation where even the text that we embed in casts now kind of like gets linked into the linked into a particular link content itself, so that it's not even like the cast is just a link and like all of the content is now stored at the pointer?
Yeah, this is sort of the pointer model. And this kind of goes back to the point David raised earlier. The one reason we didn't want to do that for the raw text is I think it's actually important to have some renderable thing that you have a guarantee is always available. Because I think there's a challenge where if you move all of the renderable content into the URL, you could actually get a cast that's just empty. Like you're like, I have no way to show anything in this cast because that URL is dead. And so the sort of design choice we made there is like there's a short text preview that you can always show that lives on the protocol guarantees you can always render and deliver it even if the URL underneath is dead. However, I think to sort of extend your idea there a little bit, a really cool extension is if you wanted to do long form posts on Farcaster, the way you could do it is to say, hey, there's a short, TLDR 320 character title that you post, but here's the long form post and you can actually do it. And on most clients, it will show up as an embed. But if you build like the long form posting client, you can actually auto expand that within the cast and render it yourself. And that actually is a really nice experience for anyone who wants to read it there.
Cool. Yep.
I think the other thing worth pointing out is what we're trying to do here is give everyone an open canvas to just start experimenting with things. But let's say like a year from now, there is like a dominant, 30% of the posts on the network have like this thing. That actually then becomes, I think, a really strong candidate for thinking about like, should this be natively supported at the protocol model versus the opposite approach where everyone has to do some version of an EIP, like an FIP, Farcaster Improvement Proposal or something. And then it's like you're gated on your permissionless innovation based on whatever the protocol is trying to optimize for. Whereas if you can actually just get traction within clients with this like very simple lightweight standard, I think that creates a lot more incentive to like, how can we better improve this content type? Because the reveal preference and market share, if you think about it, like from a total number of posts on the network, is actually using this, right? So I don't think we should say it's like stuck in stone forever, but we don't want to make it so that people can't experiment with stuff because they have to wait for some improvement proposal on GitHub.
Cool. Any other questions from folks? Okay, I want to close with two asks in particular. One of which is if you, as you're building apps, if you have ideas for like, oh, I'm trying to do this with my open graph tag for my app, but it would be really nice if we had this like additional property that doesn't exist. Basically, extend the Farcaster specific open graph tags. Like, please just DM me, throw it in the dev channel. I just want to collect a doc of all these ideas, and then like over the next few months, we'll coalesce them into something and say like, hey, here's a standard that we should try to support for the Open Graph Plus model. So just send me that as you're thinking about it, and I'll collect all of it. Same ask for the cast metadata. If you're like, oh, here's a piece of data I would really like for it to live alongside the cast, like this is a piece of location data, or this is a piece of X. Again, I want to collect it. It's most likely that this will be freeform, but I'm just kind of curious what people are playing around with and to see if I can model like how you can fit it into that freeform data so we can make the right decision on how big this should be and how much data it should allow and whether there should be any structure, right? Is it just like unbounded set of bytes, or is it kind of a little more like Ethereum logs where you have these 4 chunks of bytes, or what is the right permutation that will give people the most flexibility to build stuff? So those are kind of two asks as you're thinking about stuff over the next few months, and we'll dial this in more over time. Cool. Brian had a question on when are we launching amps? I think we've got it on our roadmap for like to actually design the way it works and think a little more about it sometime in March. This is not a firm deadline of like, hey, we're launching in March, but more just like that's roughly when we're thinking about designing and getting something out there. Anything you want to add on that, Dan?
No, I think it's just there's work to do. We need to think through like how to actually migrate what a follower is into subscriber versus amps. We need to think about the APIs that we have from the Merkle clients so that other clients can quickly boot up, because if they're not going to be decentralized, it's like, okay, the ability to sync back and forth, I think is important, and just getting a lot of feedback from folks. So I don't think it's something we want to rush up.
Yeah, and Brian, I don't know if you saw this, but let me see if I can, I'll drop this doc in the link here, but this is kind of our like rough roadmap for client and server. So we talk a little bit about this. The stuff that's in dotted lines is more like, hey, this is approximately when we think it'll happen, but there's a decent amount of variance. And the stuff that's in bold lines is like, hey, this is definitely shipping. So we've got the protocol stuff here and the client stuff here. So I'm just gonna share this here and we'll update this like once a month. Cool. Okay, we'll close this topic and kind of move back to the agenda. And let's see. Okay, yeah, last two things. Request for help. So if anyone is looking to work on open source stuff, there's open hub issues and open contract issues here. So if you want to work on like the distributed part of the hub, there's a bunch of good stuff to work on here. And the contract side of things also has a few tickets where we could use help. So feel free to grab an issue. There's things ranging from really small fixes that you get done in like an hour to big meaty projects that might take like a week and everything sort of in between. So first time contributors are definitely welcome here. The last thing, I want to give two shout outs. Casey, I actually don't know if you're on this call, but Casey's actually been doing a bunch of great work, merged a couple of PRs, and also made some like pretty good benchmarks that have illustrated that we may want to change the serialization format that we're using, and we're digging into that today. So thank you for all your help on that one. And then Xerox Anu on Farcaster has also been merging some PRs on the contract side of thing, helping us getting like better linting tools and making some of the upgrades we need to move to mainnet. So appreciate all the help there. Awesome.
Real protocol. It's we got a whole bunch of different people working on it now, not just some Merkle folks.
Yeah. All right. I will have one last call for questions if there's any other topics that are not on here that people want to chat about today. And if not, we'll do a wrap. Going once, going twice. All right. Thank you all for coming, and see you here 2 weeks from now. Later, folks.